Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on mastering your qualitative methodology. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Rachel. I'm a senior qualitative research mentor here at Statistics Solutions. You can see some of our contact information on this slide, and you will see this repeated throughout today's webinar. And then you'll also see it again. So we are a full service dissertation editing company. We are here to help doctoral students through really every phase of the dissertation process. So whether that is that you're still having some difficulty developing your topic and need a little assistance with that, all the way through to the end to that final PowerPoint when you defend your dissertation and everything in between. So we have mentors on staff. We've been through the process. We provide assistance with qualitative research, quantitative research, really, whatever you might need assistance with. So for more information, you can email us at info@statisticssolutions.com. You can check out our website, statisticssolutions.com, which has all kinds of free goodies and resources, including our blog available to you. Really, so many topics covered on the blog. So anything you can think of, we've got it. We do also offer a complimentary 30-minute consultation. And this is really so that we can get to know you a little bit better, get to know your research a little bit better, and see how we can, custom fit what we do to your own needs. And so you can schedule that using this link, and it will be posted within the hour of the webinar, also in the chat as well. But you can self-schedule. So if you don't want to email anyone or pick up the phone, you can just go to that link and get yourself scheduled for a time that is convenient for you within our hours. I will also have Mel with me in the background in just a moment, and she will be fielding any questions that come in during the webinar about what we do here at Statistics Solutions. Okay, so what I will do is leave time at the end of the webinar. If you have questions about the content of the webinar, so qualitative methodology, please go ahead and pop that into the question and answer box. That is where I will see it. And at the end of today's webinar, I will answer those questions for everyone so we can all, hear the answer and share that. Okay, so again, for those coming in late, my name is Rachel. I'm a senior qualitative research mentor here at Statistics Solutions. This is the Mastering Your Qualitative Methodology webinar, and we can do question and answer at the end. Again, if you have questions related to qualitative methods, please put those in the question and answer box in Zoom in the webinar. Okay, that's the question and answer box. And I will get to those at the end of the session today. You'll also receive a copy of the webinar tomorrow and the slide deck. So if you did come in late, you'll have access to that recording as well. They're also available archived on our website, statisticssolutions.com, along with all of the other webinars that we host as well. So if you are looking for help with your literature review or maybe quantitative methods instead, that information is also available on our website. So this is an overview of the qualitative methods chapter, but it's also a bit of an overview of today's webinar, okay? Because this is what we'll be touching on in the webinar. And this is really a sort of high-level overview of those main components of a methods chapter. So starting off with your introduction, just as you would any other chapter, you should include some section on your research design and the rationale for that, the role of the researcher, the methodology, issues of trustworthiness, and a summary that looks back to what you've covered in the chapter and then transitions into the next chapter. So this list of sections in the chapter is one that I have compiled just over the years and working with students from different schools, sort of those key sections that need to go into this chapter. Now, I will always tell you, defer to what your school uses. So if there is a template or a checklist from your school, you need to go with that, okay? But if you need some kind of roadmap and you don't have that available to you, if you get each of these sections included in your methods chapter, you will be good to go. Okay, so we'll touch on each of these sections and specifically what needs to go into them in this webinar. The introduction, like introductions to your other chapters, you want to restate the purpose of the study for your reader. Okay, this needs to be verbatim. Okay, everywhere that you write the purpose of your study in your dissertation needs to be verbatim. It needs to be exactly the same everywhere. Okay, I say this all the time. Words have meaning, and a slight change, if you think you're going to mix it up, you know, make it so that it maybe sounds more interesting than the last time you said it. It's great in theory, but not in practice. This is not the time to change things up or get creative. Exactly as you have stated the purpose in your introduction chapter, that's how you do it here. Okay. You also want to highlight the sections of the chapter. Okay. So looking back again at the, the last slide, those sections that I just outlined and those that we'll talk about in today's webinar, you want to highlight and just give a little preview of what sections are to come. Okay. You're creating a roadmap for your reader. Think about holding the reader's hand as you move with them through the chapter. It should be logical. It should all flow nicely from one section to the next. So you don't want to leave anything to surprise. It's, in this chapter, I include these sections. Okay, preview those sections, and then we get on to really the meat of the chapter. So the research design, okay, here you want to again restate your research questions. And just like the purpose of the study, these are verbatim, exactly as they appear in your chapter 1. Okay, restate your research questions for the reader. You don't want the reader to have to go back to your first chapter and read things again. Okay, hold their hand, walk them through. So restate the research questions. Then you want to identify whatever that concept is that you're studying. If it's a case study, then whatever that case is. If it's a phenomenological study, then whatever the phenomenon is. Okay, whatever it is that you're studying, identify and define that for the reader. Okay, you may have already done this in your introduction. Okay, in your chapter 1, and that's fine. Okay, this is where you elaborate on all of that. So identify and define the phenomenon or the case or the concept that you propose to study. Okay, you want to identify the tradition, and I'm going to assume that if you're in this webinar, it's probably qualitative, but you identify the tradition that you're using, qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods, could be that as well. And your research design. Okay, so are you conducting a case study? Are you conducting a phenomenological study? Are you conducting one of the many other qualitative designs that are available as options? Okay, so identify what that design is. And there are a couple of things that you want to do in this section. First, what you need to do is demonstrate that you understand what qualitative research is, what it's good for, why it's useful. And you want to demonstrate that you understand different qualitative designs and why they are good and useful, and when they're appropriate and when they are not. Okay, so you can think of it as building the case for which is the most appropriate research design for your own study. Okay, and to do that, you need to be familiar with several different options. You also need to be able to show your reader and your chair and your reviewers that you're familiar with all of these different approaches, but make the case that one of them is most appropriate. Okay, so you want to justify why that particular approach and design are appropriate for your study. Okay, and that's what you'll do in this section. So when is a qualitative design good? When we're working with textual data, this is sort of signal that qualitative research is probably appropriate. Okay, if you're interviewing people, if you are conducting focus groups, if you are analyzing documents or conducting observations, okay, these are generally characteristic of a qualitative study, a qualitative research design. If your research questions say something about perspectives or experiences and understanding perspectives and experiences, that's a good key that we're looking at qualitative research, okay? Because we come to that understanding through interviews and focus groups, right? So textual data, conducting interviews, understanding experiences that people have probably are components of qualitative research. The goal here is not necessarily to generalize. You hear that more in quantitative designs, okay? We don't test hypotheses as quantitative researchers do. We don't quantify our results in the way that quantitative researchers do, okay? Less numbers, more text, basically, for qualitative design. So I want to touch on a couple of options for qualitative research designs. And this list is absolutely not exhaustive. There are plenty of other qualitative designs that you might select from that might be more appropriate for your own dissertation and your own research. These are the designs that I see more commonly in the students I work with. Okay, in particular, case studies, phenomenological studies, and what we might call generic qualitative studies. Grounded theory and ethnography, I do see from time to time, in the students I work with, but certainly less commonly, and they are tied a little bit more particularly, a little bit more specifically to certain disciplines as opposed to others. Okay, but again, this list isn't all of them. Okay, and this is going to be a really high level overview of each design. Okay, I mean really high level because we simply don't have time to go in depth into all of the different qualitative designs, but this should give you a good sort of basic understanding, enough to say, oh, well, maybe this is appropriate for me, so that you can do a deeper dive into these. So case studies are really helpful when we're looking at a specific example of something, perhaps over time, and we're looking really in depth. Okay, so this could be something that's an atypical case. It could be an exemplary case. The case could provide a counterpoint to something that we already know, or something that possibly leads us into a new direction. But the idea with a case study is that you're going for this really in-depth examination and in-depth analysis of this one or more, if it's a multiple case study, case that's bounded by some uniting factor. Okay, if it's multiple. So the boundaries then are established such that everything within those boundaries is part of that case, and everything outside of those boundaries is not part of the case. So what do I mean by this? Let's say we are looking at something in education, and there is a new math curriculum that a school district is implementing at the middle school level. Okay, and there are maybe 8 middle schools in the district. Okay, so they've implemented this new curriculum, and of the 8 schools that have implemented this, 7 have seen improved performance in students, and 1 of them has not. Okay, so that might be an atypical case. So you might wonder what's going on there. Okay, why is this one school, why are we not seeing improved performance, improved student performance? Okay, so that could be a case. So you might conduct a single case study, okay, where you're looking, it's bound by not just the school, but you're looking at math classrooms that have adopted this new curriculum. Okay. To conduct case studies, we often use multiple data collection methods. This is really characteristic of a case study, because if we're going for an in-depth examination of a case, we need to examine it from all angles, right? All facets. So we might interview teachers about implementing this curriculum. Okay. Perhaps you conduct some classroom observations, if you can get that through your IRB. Okay. So that you can see what's going on in the classroom. Maybe you talk to some administrators as well at the school level. Okay. Or maybe some math coaches. So there are different points of data collection so that you can really build this case. And so the idea is that it generates this rich description of whatever that case is. Okay, so in this example, you know, that math classroom, right, where students are still struggling or they haven't seen a performance improvement. And so through data analysis, then you will be able to explore the main themes that emerge from the study of those cases. Or, you know, if it's just a single case, what those themes are, those patterns in the data that point us to what's going on. So phenomenological studies are fairly different from case studies. This is really rooted in, ultimately in philosophy, but also in psychology as well. So here, the idea is that you're studying something about the lived experience and how participants assign meaning to that experience. Okay, so it's really heavy on the psychological component, right? What is it like to go through that experience? What are the feelings associated with it? How do people talk about it? What words do they use? Okay, and so here, using multiple data collection methods is maybe not as useful or appropriate than conducting in-depth interviews with participants who have all been through that experience. Okay, and when I say in-depth, I'm talking about, you know, a minimum of an hour, but certainly can be much longer and can even be repeated in-depth interviews where you return to the same participants a couple of times. And so the idea is to really show what the commonalities of that experience are between the participants or the individuals who have been through it. And sort of distilling down to find what is the core of that phenomenon, what is the core or that essence of the experience. Okay, so again, really heavily psychological here, right? And very different from what we see in a case study. Now, sometimes what happens, though, is that your study doesn't fit quite into a case study, and it doesn't quite fit into a phenomenological study or any of the other options. And so this is when I think a generic qualitative design can be very, very helpful. In this context, we are not talking about generic in a negative or bad way. I think that the term itself has a negative sort of association for a lot of people. And I've heard this from chairs too. I have had students come to me, asking, how do I defend this as an appropriate design when my chair thinks it isn't good enough? Well, it is good enough. It's perfectly fine if it makes sense for your study. Okay, it just means that a case study isn't the most appropriate, or an ethnographic study isn't the most appropriate. So if your research question and the problem and the purpose of your study don't fit squarely with another design, or if it has elements of different designs, perhaps if the focus is less on the psychological, so the inward, and more just on the outward or the experience itself, or maybe if your study is mixed methods, then a generic qualitative design can be appropriate. And what this allows is greater flexibility when it comes to selecting the right data collection tools and methods, and the right data analysis tools and methods. Okay, so you can collect data through interviews, through questionnaires, through surveys, really, whatever makes the most sense for your study. Okay, so you have options here as opposed to some of the other designs that are much more prescribed based on the design. Okay, and so the goal really is this outer world understanding. Okay, again, the understanding of perhaps the experience, but not how people make meaning of the experience, not that inward reflection. Okay, and so I realized that 2015, even though in my head it's just a couple of years ago, I guess it's not so much anymore. But for those of you who are interested in this, or who are having a difficult time justifying a generic qualitative design, I point you to this citation. Check out Percy and colleagues 2015 for a good overview of when generic is appropriate and how to get this justified in the right way for your methods chapter. Now, the other designs that I see, again, I don't see them very commonly. Okay, grounded theory is one of those. This is pretty heavily tied to social sciences like sociology, anthropology, and is sort of often thought of as not for novice researchers. It's very helpful when there's not a lot known about a topic, because you're sort of working headfirst into the study, into the research. Okay, the goal is to generate theory or some explanatory framework, okay, based on your data. So from the perspectives of your participants, okay, you're deriving theory grounded in the data. This is really different from what we've just talked about in some of the other designs, because you don't begin necessarily with a theoretical framework, don't necessarily even begin with super refined research questions. Okay, you work your way in, and you do this through field work, through interviews, a lot of writing, memoing, maybe text and document analysis. And so the idea is that there is something you want to know more about, that is the research, and you interview people about that topic, and you analyze those first however many interviews, and see sort of what comes out of that. And then you refine your ideas and your research questions, and then you interview more people based on that. And so eventually you get to this point of theoretical saturation where you sort of exhausted all possible information about this topic. That if you were to interview more participants, you wouldn't necessarily gain new insight. Okay, so again, the theory in this case comes from the data. And so you're looking for this explanation of the process or action, whatever it is that you're studying. Grounded theory also takes a considerable amount of time, which is probably why I don't see it as often at the doctoral level. And the same with ethnography. Okay, so it's another one where it can take a little bit more time. This is very heavily tied to anthropology. So really, when you are looking at sort of understanding a problem in the broader cultural or social societal context, then this might be a good design. The studies are very holistic in nature, ethnographic studies, looking at all parts. So networks, interconnections between people and groups and institutions. And ethnography is done through extended field work and what we call participant observation. So it's not just standing back and observing what people are doing, but it's actively participating in this to really understand what it's like to be, you know, another person, really, to get that sort of firsthand account. So interviews are part of this, conversations are part of this, extensive field notes are part of this. But, you know, when I say extended field work, the gold standard for a really long time was really 1 to 2 years worth of field work. That is less the case now, but certainly there is a time commitment associated with ethnography that's very different from some other qualitative designs. And the goal of ethnography really is this in-depth account of the research problem within this larger context of the culture and society from the perspective of the participants. So that all falls within this research design section. The role of the researcher is another section that you'll want to flesh out in this chapter. And it's, what is your role in the research? Are you simply an observer? Are you a participant? Do you belong to the community you're studying? You know, are you both? Okay, and this is where you really want to talk about any potential ethical issues, conflicts of interest, power dynamics that might arise in your research and how you plan to mitigate those. Okay, so if we're back to our case study where we're looking at this math curriculum, you know, are you the principal and are you proposing to work with the teachers at your school? Well, that is a power dynamic issue. Okay, so probably your IRB wouldn't allow that. Okay, but you would have to talk about how you plan to mitigate that power dynamic. Okay, or, you know, are you a member of the population you're studying and you have other biases just because of your own life and experience? So how do you plan to mitigate those as well? This is where you talk about all of that. You know, research has bias, researchers have bias. We need to describe what we plan to do to minimize that. But we are humans, we're working with other humans. So there's always going to be some degree of bias. Okay, all we can do is mitigate and minimize all of that. So this is where you outline how to do that. Your methodology section will probably be broken into several smaller headings or sections. So you want to include a section on your participants. Okay, and this is where you outline the population of people from which you'll draw your sample. So this is all of the possible people who could be in your study, who could be participants in your study. But of course, you're not going to include all of the possible people in your study. So you're going to sample those. So you want to talk also about your sampling strategy. Now, in quantitative research, they use random sampling might be more appropriate, and some other detailed methods. But in qualitative designs, we most often use non-random sampling, okay? You'll hear the terms purposive or purposeful, most commonly used. So the idea is that, if you are looking at something really specific, like how someone has made meaning of an experience that they've been through, well, we need some way of ensuring that they've been through that experience before we bring them on board as participants. So sort of by definition, it can't be random, right? We need to make sure that they meet certain criteria. So to do that, then we outline inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so you'll want to include in this section what those inclusion criteria are. So to be eligible to participate in your study, what are the criteria that people need to meet? Okay, and how will you verify that prior to onboarding them as participants? You'll also want to outline the number of participants, or if it's a case study, the number of cases, if that is applicable to your study, and justify that number of participants, okay? You'll outline the steps, and you want to kind of think of this in recipe fashion, the steps to identify, contact, and recruit participants. So you want to write this in narrative form. You don't want to bullet point this in your chapter, but you do want to outline very, very clearly all of those steps that you'll take in order. Okay, so first I do this, second I do this, third I do this. The other thing to note here is that the more detailed and the more specific you get with this in your methods chapter, the easier your IRB application will be, because you will already have outlined all of these steps, and IRB is going to ask for it again. Okay. We'll also talk about the size of your sample and data saturation. So how that sample size, the number of your participants, how that relates to data saturation, or the point at which you are no longer receiving novel data from your participants. So if you were to interview another participant or two, you wouldn't learn anything new, okay? You will include another subsection on instrumentation. So all of your data collection instruments. So are you conducting interviews? Are you going to conduct observations? Whatever those data collection methods are, you'll need an instrument for them. So an interview protocol. If you're conducting observations, you'll have an observation sheet or an observation protocol that outline those specific things that you'll be looking for, okay, when you conduct your observations. So for each instrument, then you want to talk about, is this something that has already been created? So has somebody already used this before? And if that's the case, you need to ensure that you have permission to use that instrument. Or will you be creating your own instrument? Okay, and so if you're creating your own, say, interview protocol, then it's a good idea to kind of sketch out some of the questions that might be in the interview protocol, or include the interview protocol as an appendix and mention that in your methods chapter. If you are conducting a document review, you want to describe how you'll identify that source material and how you'll verify accuracy of those documents. Okay, basically demonstrating how and why each source of data is sufficient and critical to address the research question or questions of your study. You also outline the procedures here. So for each of those instruments that you have described in your instrumentation section, you want to include where you will collect your data and why. Who will collect data? So most likely you, but maybe you are one of those lucky people who has research assistants. And maybe it's a research assistant who's collecting data on your behalf. The frequency, duration of data collection events, how you'll record data, And any contingency plans. Expect the unexpected. People drop out of studies all the time. Okay, so how will you make sure that you account for loss to attrition, for example, if people do drop out or if you can't, follow up with them? You also want to outline your plans for debriefing your participants, for example, after you've interviewed them, and any follow-up procedures that you're going to use. So will you have them, for example, review their transcripts once their interviews are transcribed, and provide feedback on that? So this is the section where you outline all of that information. You'll also include your data analysis plan. And so for each type of data, if it's interviews or observations or document analysis or anything like that, you want to describe how those data are connected to the research. So how those data address the research question and how you plan to analyze those data. And it might be the case that you're using a data analysis plan like thematic analysis, for example, where you can apply that to interviews and you can also apply it to document analysis as well. And that's perfectly fine. But again, you want to describe the procedures, coding procedures, and again, justify its use based on your own study. Okay. Outline any of the software that you use in analysis. There is a ton of great qualitative analysis software out there. None of them do the analysis for you, but they are sure helpful for helping us qualitative researchers organize the data nicely so that we can see emerging patterns. Okay. And then the other thing that you'll do in this section is describe how you plan to handle any discrepant cases. So any of those instances where you sort of don't have agreement, okay, between participants. So a lot of times it's the case that, you might have, let's say, 13 participants and 12 of them all sort of describe an experience in one way, right? So they all sort of follow this pattern. And then you have that 13th person who maybe had a totally different experience. So in this section, you want to outline how you would handle that 13th person. Okay, so that discrepant case, where do you factor that into your analysis? You'll include a section on trustworthiness of your data. So how you plan to establish these sort of the four key tenets of trustworthiness. So credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. And this reads, I apologize for this, the slide sort of reads as though, triangulation or audit trail or member checking are mutually exclusive to credibility, dependability, confirmability, respectively, and that's not the case. Triangulation can be used to establish, not only credibility, but other aspects of trustworthiness. So this is really just planning for how you will establish these in your study. And you'll include a section on ethical procedures. And again, this is another section where the more detailed you can be here, the easier your IRB application will go. But you'll want to describe any of the, site permissions or agreements with possible research sites where you might be conducting your research, so that things are above board. You can't just walk into a school and start interviewing teachers and nobody knows that you're there. You have to have permission either from, a school official or a school district official. So this is where you outline, who you have permission from. If there are separate IRB, institutional review board applications that you need to go through, and sometimes this is the case. Sometimes you will have to, apply for approval, not only with your university, but your potential research site as well. So just, sort of be prepared for that. This is where you outline treatment of human participants. treatment of human subjects, so that your IRB can make sure that you're not going to harm anyone while doing your research. Okay, so ethical considerations related to recruitment, ethical considerations related to data collection. You want to kind of think through what these might be in advance of collecting data. Treatment of data, how you plan to handle your data once you've collected it. Okay, anonymity versus confidentiality. It is unlikely as qualitative researchers that we're conducting a lot of anonymous research, because that would mean that we don't know who our subjects are. And because we interact with our, subjects, our participants in kind of a different way than, say, quantitative researchers might, certainly not always, of course. Usually what we have to do is maintain our participants' confidentiality, which means that we know who they are, but we are protecting their information so that no one else knows who they are. Okay. Any plans to secure data? Data must be maintained for a certain period of time that is usually dictated by your university. Okay, and you will need to describe how you are going to protect those data, where you are going to store those data. We're looking at specificity here. Things like password protected laptop, encrypted files, locked filing cabinet in a locked office, and you're the only one with access to it, those kinds of things, because again, we want to maintain confidentiality, both of our participants and of our data. So the final section, then again, we're pulling the reader along. So again, think looking back to the chapter, what those main key points were that you've highlighted in the chapter, and then looking forward and transitioning to the next chapter. So provide a recap of the main sections, sort of at a glance, kind of a little snapshot, like an elevator pitch of, if someone didn't read the chapter, what would you need to include in the summary, so they had some idea of what your research design and methods looked like. You can recap problem, purpose, research question, methods, and methodology. You want to think of it as, everything flows from the thing before it. So you establish the problem and then the purpose, and then your research questions derive from the purpose of your study, and then your research questions help determine, what methods and methodology you use. So I do have some other tips if you're having a hard time getting started with the methods chapter, and that's probably why some of you are here. You know what needs to go into it, but you're spinning your wheels. And I see this all the time with my participants, or I'm sorry, with my students that I work with, not my participants, with the students that I work with. Okay. This can be a challenging chapter to write because it works a little bit differently from the introduction chapter, from the lit review chapter. You're not summarizing and synthesizing and critiquing literature anymore. Here you are planning for a study that you are going to conduct that you haven't conducted yet. And you have maybe had a class or two on methods, but you're never going to get to know methods like you do for this chapter. Okay. No class is going to prepare you in quite the same way. So it can be really overwhelming, is my point, but it doesn't have to be. Don't allow yourself to be overwhelmed by this. Okay. Understand that you are in the learning process. This is part of the learning process. That's the whole point of the dissertation, is learning how to do research. Okay. So that's what this is. Okay. The other thing that I think trips people up is getting hung up on the what if. What if something goes wrong? What if I can't recruit the number of participants that I plan to recruit? What if, the research site that I plan to use doesn't work out? What if? Who cares? What if doesn't matter. Okay, you plan as best as you can. Let me tell you, everybody writing a dissertation in 2019 and early 2020, nobody was planning for the what if of a global pandemic. Okay, and it happened and people got through it, right? Things are going to change. They might change in major ways, they might change in really small ways. Okay, but it's okay. It's okay to feel overwhelmed by this chapter too, but you really don't have to, and you don't want to let it paralyze you into not sort of taking action and getting started. So start with your problem, start with your purpose, start with your research questions, and just sort of ask yourself these questions. You could sketch them out on paper, you could sketch them out, in a Word document on your computer. What data do I need to answer these research questions? To address the problem and the purpose. Who do I need to talk to get the answers? What documents will give me the answers? What observations will give me the answers? Okay, and go from there. You want to think about it, this chapter is a recipe, okay? There's the methods and the methodology. The methods are the ingredients in the chocolate chip cookies, okay, of your study. And the instructions, that's the methodology. You have to have both, okay? And it needs to be written in a way that someone else can understand. So just as with chocolate chip cookies, it's not enough to say you need this much butter and this much brown sugar and this many chocolate chips, okay? Because we don't have the instructions. But also, we can't just have the instructions, right, that tell us what to do with the butter and the brown sugar and the chocolate chips if we don't know how much of each of those to put in. So you have the ingredients and you have the instructions. Plan for contingencies. Plan for something to go wrong, okay? But understand that it might, and that's okay. You can handle that later. That's where, you might talk about, you aimed to recruit 20 participants and you recruited 10. And so maybe that's a limitation of your study and you address it as a limitation in your discussion chapter. Okay, but don't get so concerned with the what ifs that you don't ever get started with this chapter, because you can get through it. Everyone who has a PhD has gotten through this before. You absolutely can too. Okay, if you're still stuck though, if you do still need a little bit of help, that's why we're here. So again, we are Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation consulting and editing company. And our whole goal, the reason why we do this, we have been through the process and we want to help you get through the process in a timely manner so that you can get on with the rest of your life. Okay. Again, you can schedule a complimentary consultation to talk to us more about your project so we can get a better idea about who you are, about your research, and how we can help out with the process. Okay, so you can, again, email info@statisticsolutions.com. You can give us a call. You can go onto our website. And again, our website, statisticsolutions.com, we have all kinds of other really awesome resources available for graduate students related to all chapters of the dissertation, qualitative, quantitative, design methods, all of that. So we do have about 10 minutes. If you have questions, please go ahead and use the question and answer section of Zoom to make sure that I see those. Okay. I do have a question about a copy of the slide presentation, and yes, everyone will be receiving a copy of the presentation, I think no later than tomorrow. And then it will also be archived on our website at statisticsolutions.com. And we also have a ton of other archived webinars there on all dissertation chapters, really anything, anything you can think of. If you need help with it, it's available for you there. But yeah, everyone will receive a copy. The next question is, in quantitative research, more concrete methods are available to determine sample size, i.e. sample size calculator, right? What recommendations do you give to select a starting point for sample size in qualitative research, realizing more subjects may be needed later if saturation does not seem to be achieved? So this is a great question. This is where I always recommend turning to the literature and turning to other studies that other scholars have conducted that are similar to your own, and looking at what kind of sample size they used. But the other thing that can be really helpful is digging into some of the methods literature on data saturation. There are some articles that are available related to data saturation and sort of estimates of at what point we might find or achieve data saturation. So those should give you a good sort of starting point in terms of like a ballpark of what you want to aim for in terms of your sample. I have a question about mixed methods versions of this presentation. I do not believe, I think that's the one that we are not currently presenting, but if you go to our website, let me dig around for the webinars page. I believe that we have one or two archived on mixed methods. Let me see if I can grab that link real quick. I'm gonna pop that into the chat here. It's available. You'll see upcoming webinars and webinar archive library. And so, yeah, so any archived, including mixed methods webinar would be in there. Yeah, but I don't think that we have any currently planned. It's definitely something that we might talk about for the future. I have a question on suggestion for a design appropriate for the problem of implication of party contestations on democratization. That is pretty specific, and sort of just based on topic alone, I don't have enough information to get you probably pointed in quite the right direction, unfortunately. It really, the design really has to come from, first you establish the research problem and then develop the purpose statement, and then the research questions. And then from all of that, that's what drives the research design. So there's some of those other kind of pieces that need to be in place to be able to make a good recommendation about research design. I have about 5 more minutes if there are other questions. Any questions can just be typed into the question and answer box, so everyone can see those and I can answer live. Looks like I've got a question in the chat. I don't do ANOVA in this. This is qualitative only. I'm sorry. We do have quantitative webinars that you could check out where they would go over that more. I have a question on thematic analysis use for phenomenological analysis. What practical method? So I'm assuming you're talking about sort of like specific thematic analysis. The people I recommend the most are Brown and Clark. They are, I think, sort of the most straightforward in their approach. It's very, I don't want to say simple, that's not what I'm trying to say, but it's straightforward. So if, you're sort of like not totally comfortable with qualitative data analysis, there's not like a whole lot of specialized wording and, all of that kind of thing. So, I would recommend Brown and Clark. I'm going to type them because they're both spelled a little bit differently for you, but that's who I would recommend. So a clarifying point, familiar with them, and with Smith, yeah, so more about the actual organization of the themes. I don't want to cut out the themes. Right. Is your supervisor's asking you to cut out themes? So what's happening? Right. I mean, so in terms of actual organization of the themes, yeah, either way, I generally present results by the themes and then sub themes. Because I think it's more characteristic of that type of analysis. And my general sort of opinion, even though some schools will say other, is, that presenting results takes what it takes, it takes as long as it takes. So you don't necessarily have to cut themes out. But I would present hierarchically. So, themes, sub themes, or if it's IPA, then themes, superordinate themes, subordinate themes, just whatever that terminology is that the analysis calls for. I have a question about APA writing format. Does this presentation reflect? This presentation doesn't really. I have another question on any comments on how to document researcher reflex. I think you mean reflexivity through the research process, but yeah, I really recommend like journaling and field notes, and especially as issues arise when you're journaling, sort of exploring those a little bit more in terms of how you are feeling about issues that have come up, that you need to interrogate a little bit more in terms of your own biases. So, and whatever's comfortable for you in terms of the journaling process, right? So if it's, keeping a physical notebook, or if it's, doing that on a tablet, a laptop, a computer, whichever makes the most sense for you. There's not really any one good way to do it, but just taking care that you're really paying attention to your own sort of feelings and thoughts about your research in the process. Well, we are at time. Thanks again so much for joining me this afternoon. Again, if you do still need help, that's why we're here. You can schedule a complimentary consultation with us. Check out our website for other archived webinars. Check out upcoming webinars that we host. We've got a lot of really good resources for you. So happy writing. Thanks again for attending. Take care. Bye.